The sun hit the parking lot like a blade slicing through rows of polished SUVs. Elena Moore knelt by the bus, her lunchbox small and plain, a sandwich wrapped in paper, an apple bruised at one side. She had barely opened it when Travis, in his spotless white polo and mirrored sunglasses, reached over and took it. "You won't need this," he joked, holding it up as his friends laughed and snapped photos. The laughter echoed off the metal doors, bright and cruel. Elena froze hands still hovering in the air, the faint smell of engine oil clinging to her skin. Gina Rourke, the manager, glanced their way, smiled politely, and turned back to her phone. Not a word. From across the lot, a man in a gray t-shirt and low-pulled cap watched, silent, motionless. His eyes stayed fixed on the scene, cold and calculating, as if weighing the worth of every soul present. Stay till the end, because the truth you'll see next will change how you treat strangers. He blended in without effort. Just another traveler in the midday heat, gray t-shirt, crisp shoes, spotless face unreadable beneath the shade of his cap. Harlan moved with quiet rhythm, jotting brief notes in a slim notebook no one noticed. Around him, chatter rippled complaints about heat traffic service while Elena guided the group through the marble courtyard, her voice steady but thinning under the weight of repetition. He watched her from a precise distance, the kind that revealed more than closeness could. When she glanced at her watch, he caught the faint flicker of resignation. Another shift shortened, another break erased. Behind the calm efficiency, he saw fatigue gathering in the corner of her eye, the kind that doesn't belong to physical strain but to daily disregard. He marked it silently, knowing this rhythm, the slow erosion of dignity, was the truest language of neglect. At the next stop, Elena unfolded a wrinkled map on the hood of the bus. Her nails were short, the paper soft at the folds, its corners darkened by use. She spoke about history, culture, and time, all while clutching a cheap plastic bottle held together by a strip of clear tape. The sun burned down, tracing a thin sheen of sweat along her temple. No one seemed to notice. Two of the guests drifted toward the shade, scrolling through their phones, nodding absently at her words. But her tone never faltered. It was practiced professional, carrying more respect for her work than she was shown in return. From a few steps away, Harlan observed her composure, the tidy gestures, the way she smoothed the map after every gust of wind. Each movement spoke of restraint, of someone who refused to lose grace even when no one was watching. Inside, the air-conditioned office numbers glowed across the screen, KPI charts, revenue forecasts, neat columns of percentages. Gina Rourke studied them with a soft smile that never reached her eyes. She complimented the VIPs for their energy, then crossed out the lunch budget line in red ink. Efficiency, she called it. Profit in her vocabulary was a polite disguise for hunger. Passing Elena on her way out, Gina's smile lingered, thin managerial void of warmth. She told the receptionist, prioritize Travis's group as if courtesy were currency. Harlan, standing near the doorway, caught every word. He wrote down the time, the tone, even the pause between sentences. The irony was precise, a system polished on the surface, quietly feeding on the people who kept it running. Behind that immaculate smile, he saw the structure cold, perfect, and utterly humanless. They moved from one luxury landmark to another, a caravan of curated ease. Elena's voice, steady but thin, guided them through marble corridors and glass terraces that shimmered with reflected heat. She spoke clearly, conserving breath, her professionalism masking exhaustion. Travis interrupted often, demanding private shortcuts, exclusive photos, a different pace that suited only him. Each request carved minutes out of her break minutes that never returned. Harlan checked his watch time. Owed time denied. Near the fountain stood an empty bench, its metal too hot to touch, yet no one thought to offer it. He unscrewed a bottle of water and handed it to her. She smiled politely and declined. The contrast struck him, the grace of someone giving everything surrounded by people who gave nothing back. In the heat, kindness was evaporating faster than sweat. Her uniform, once blue, had faded into a weary gray, the color of patience stretched thin. Inside her pocket, a small napkin folded neatly, a gesture of quiet order in a world that rarely returned it. A guest called her name, asking for a selfie. Elena obliged, tilting her head, her smile practiced flawless, almost weightless. But her eyes gave nothing. Harlan stood several steps behind the frame, unfolding in layers, tourist in the foreground, Elena in the center, and himself at the far edge, half-shadowed observer. Between them lay a gulf, invisible yet vast service mistaken for servitude. He felt it like static in the air, the dissonance of one human bending while another never noticed. Her smile, he realized, wasn't hospitality, it was armor. And every flash of a camera added another dent to it. Behind the grand lobby's gleam stretched a narrow corridor that smelled of bleach and fatigue. The walls were chipped, the tiles uneven, the hum of fluorescent lights constant. On a bulletin board, the schedule was slashed with pen marks, names moved, hours erased. Elena's break had been reduced again, circled in red. Dean signed for a replacement shift without looking up. Mara slipped a biscuit into her pocket before heading back to the floor. Small rebellions swallowed before they began. Harlan paused before the board, memorizing its chaos like a crime scene, every alteration a small theft disguised as management. He didn't need a camera. His memory was enough. Each smudge, each correction was proof that exploitation no longer screamed, it whispered, hid behind policy, and called itself order. The memo arrived at noon, a company-wide email wrapped in corporate warmth. To enhance guest experience, it began before slicing through the paragraph with sterile precision. Lunch breaks were to be integrated into workflow. Gina forwarded it within minutes, her subject line ending with a frozen smile emoji. A gesture so small yet sharp enough to cut. Kurt read it, shrugged, deleted. No one replied. The office continued its quiet hum screens glowing like obedient eyes. Elena looked at her phone for a long moment, then slid it back into her pocket. There was no protest, no sigh, only the shared stillness of people too tired to resist. Across the glass partition, Harlan caught the reflection of her screen mirrored in the window, a thin flash of white text against his own faint outline. Words had replaced decisions. Signatures had replaced thought. And in that reflection he saw it clearly. The cruelty of bureaucracy was that it always smiled while it starved you. The next morning, the lunchbox was gone again. The counter still glistened with drops of water. A paper napkin lay torn beside an empty spoon. On the trash lid, a smear of tomato sauce traced a careless fingerprint. Travis's laughter echoed from the hall, loud, easy. He was telling the others about authentic street food, pretending he didn't know whose it had been. The mockery hung in the air like heat. Near the doorway, Gina looked up from her tablet, a hint of amusement in her glance. Harlan, standing by the stainless steel wall, saw her reflection before she noticed his. The mirrored surface turned every smirk into evidence. He didn't move, didn't speak. But something inside him adjusted quietly, mechanically, like a gear tightening. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was repetition turned ritual, the kind of cruelty that survives because it's convenient. Later that day, Elena sat by the service counter, the empty lunchbox before her. She tore a page from a pocket notebook, folded it neatly once, then again. Her handwriting leaned slightly to the right, graceful even in restraint. "If you find this," she wrote, "please return it. I worked for it." She placed the note inside, closed the lid, and rested her palm on top for a breath. Her hand trembled once, then stilled. Above her, the fluorescent lights hummed faintly, their cold glow softening around the edges of her patience. From across the corridor, Harlan stopped mid-step. Through the half-open door, he saw her look upward, not in complaint, but as if reminding herself to stay composed. In that silent act, she wasn't pleading. She was documenting. It wasn't despair, it was evidence. A message not to the thief, but to the world that had stopped caring. The paper rested on the edge of the counter, folded once its corners aligned with quiet precision. Harlan reached for it, eyes narrowing, not with anger, but with calculation. He folded it again, the seam pressed tight between his fingers as though closing the distance between witness and proof. The motion was deliberate, wordless, final. He slipped the note into the inside pocket of his gray shirt where fabric met skin, and for a brief second his hand lingered there like he was anchoring something fragile in a world too quick to forget. His expression shifted, the warmth gone, replaced by the calm detachment of someone who'd seen enough to start measuring damage. He glanced at his watch. Time was still moving indifferent. Around him, people passed without pause, the hum of the lobby swallowing the moment. Yet, within that stillness, something irreversible had begun. Truth had found a keeper. Gina summoned Elena with a tone that sounded almost kind. The office lights were soft, intentionally flattering. She greeted her with a smile that could have been compassion, if not for its timing. "Let's keep this simple," Gina said, laying a hand on Elena's shoulder, gentle as silk. "Be flexible." The phrase landed like perfume, pleasant on the surface, suffocating beneath. Elena nodded, her throat tightening with practiced obedience. Around them, the staff moved quietly, their silence forming walls. Harlan, half seen through the open doorway, caught the words, his mind replaying them with precision. Be flexible. 2 harmless syllables built to bend spines. Gina's voice carried the ease of control disguised as grace, the mastery of pressing down without leaving fingerprints. When Elena stepped out, her face was calm, but her steps faltered slightly as though the weight of those words followed her like perfume that wouldn't wash off. By late afternoon, the break room had grown still heavy with unspoken truths. Dean leaned over the table, whispering, "Quiet people last longer here." Mara didn't answer. Her gaze drifted to the wall clock that hadn't worked for months. Kurt tapped 3 times against the metal counter, a habit born from nerves, not rhythm. Elena smiled faintly, the kind that dissolves before it reaches the eyes. "I'm fine," she said, the smallest lie shared between survivors. Harlan passed through the doorway, silent and visible enough not to disturb the fragile balance of fear. The air felt thick, almost visible, as if the room itself had learned to hold its breath. Beneath the hum of the vending machine, resignation pulsed like background noise, steady, quiet, fatal. No one meant harm. They had simply adapted. In this place, silence wasn't absence. It was armor-thin, but necessary. The board hung perfectly straight on the wall, white, spotless, unfeeling. Columns of numbers glowed under the harsh office lights. The line marked meal cost dipped low red and proud, while VIP satisfaction soared, high circled twice in green. Someone had added a handwritten note in the corner, "Keep it this way." The pen stroke curved with confidence, the arrogance of success disguised as order. Gina's signature trailed below it like perfume that lingered too long. Harlan stood before the chart, fingertips brushing the laminated edge. It was smooth, almost polished, reflecting his face in faint distortion. Behind him, Elena waited silently, eyes down on her shoes, their soles scuffed from endless walking. The silence between them said everything the company measured: smiles, but never hunger service, but not breath. Numbers, unlike people, never asked for fairness. They just obeyed whoever held the marker. And Gina, he thought, was fluent in that language. Throughout the day, Elena's gestures stitched together the quiet fabric of decency. She handed a map to a lost tourist, split her last bottle of water with an elderly couple bent down to tie a child's shoelace without hesitation. Later, she scribbled a restroom direction for an old man too shy to ask, then stooped to pick up a stray paper cup no one else saw. None of it was grand. None of it would ever make the metrics board. But each act was deliberate, the kind that carried a steady dignity, even in exhaustion. From across the plaza, Harlan watched not as a superior but as a witness to something his company had forgotten how to count. Her kindness wasn't noise. It was rhythm. A quiet beat against the indifference around her. In a world obsessed with performance, Elena's humanity was her only rebellion, small but precise as breath. By late afternoon, the sunlight began to fade, stretching shadows long and thin across the marble walkway. Elena's shoulders sagged slightly, her steps slower, each breath measured. Travis called out asking for an unscheduled detour, his grin wide, his tone casual. Gina approved instantly, not looking up from her tablet. "Make it work," she said as if fatigue were elastic. Elena nodded, untying the scarf around her wrist. The fabric left a faint red mark where it had pressed too long against skin. Harlan noticed the streak of irritation, small but telling a line drawn by effort no one else would see. The air was cooler now, yet somehow heavier. He felt the light thinning not just in the sky but in her movements. Every step cost her something invisible, and as he watched her disappear into the deepening gold, he realized exhaustion, when normalized, looked almost professional. That night, Harlan sat alone in his hotel room, the city humming faintly beyond the glass. On the desk before him lay the folded note. He unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases with the side of his thumb. The words were few, ordinary, almost fragile. "If you find this, please return it. I worked for it." He read them twice, then a third time, as though each repetition stripped away a layer of formality. When he folded it again, his movements were gentler, exact, aligning the edges with care. He placed it on top of his wallet, a silent marker of value. Then he looked at himself in the mirror across the room. The reflection wasn't that of an executive or a stranger in disguise. It was a man caught between guilt and recognition. His eyes, once neutral, now carried weight. In the mirror, something quiet shifted. The note was still paper, but the conviction inside him had turned to steel. The next morning, the air felt heavier. On Gina's desk lay a printed complaint bound neatly in a red folder. Unprofessional behavior toward guest Travis Henderson. The accusation was vague, but sharp enough to wound. Gina called Elena, in her voice flat. "Sign it," she said, sliding the file forward like an afterthought. Elena read every line, her hand hovering above the pen. Around them, colleagues avoided her eyes, studying screens, papers, anything that wasn't her. The office clock ticked each second too loud. From the doorway, Harlan stood still, watching the small theater of compliance unfold. It wasn't rage, he felt it was disgust disguised as calm. The document wasn't justice, it was architecture. Every paragraph designed to protect the system that had created the wound. And as Elena finally set the pen down, he knew this paper wasn't meant to record truth. It was meant to bury it. By noon, the hotel lobby gleamed under artificial light, tourists' cameras, conversations blurring together. In the middle of it, Gina stood beside the reception desk, voice clear, polite, merciless. "Effective immediately, Ms. Moore is suspended pending review." The words cut cleanly, leaving no room for error. Travis smiled, faintly satisfied, his sunglasses catching the chandelier's reflection. Elena didn't speak. She nodded once, swallowing hard, her throat tightening as she tried to keep her posture straight. Around her, employees shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Their silence was part of the ritual. Harlan's hand slipped into his pocket, finding the folded note, its paper edge digging lightly against his palm. He stayed where he was, motionless, observing the cruelty unfold as if written in policy. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. In that moment, he understood the company didn't need villains. It only needed silence dressed as professionalism. The office was nearly silent when Elena began to pack. She unclipped her name badge, laying it flat on the desk as if afraid to wake something fragile. One by one, she gathered the remains of her shift maps folded to their creased spines, a pen missing its cap, a crumpled napkin that still smelled faintly of coffee. Her cheap wristwatch came next, its face scratched but faithful. She hesitated before picking up the strip of clear tape she'd once used to mend her water bottle, turning it between her fingers like a relic. Then a long breath escaped her steady, resigned final. Across the hallway, half hidden by the shadow of a column, Harlan watched. The scene was wordless, almost too ordinary for pity, yet precise enough to hurt. Every object she touched seemed to contract with her shrinking into silence. Dignity, he thought, didn't vanish in disgrace. It folded itself down, neat and quiet, until no one could see it bleed. Evening settled in layers of amber and gray. From the balcony overlooking the parking lot, Harlan gripped the iron railing, his knuckles whitening under the fading light. The air was heavy with heat and memory, the metallic echo of laughter, the sharp image of a stolen lunch. Below him, the same space looked different now, sterile, indifferent. He flexed his hands, once veins visible beneath the skin, and drew a breath that trembled between control and anger. The world kept moving, cars pulling out, voices floating upward, but inside him something had stopped yielding. The line of his mouth hardened into resolve. This wasn't about management or policy anymore. It was about the slow corrosion of conscience he'd let run unchecked. The sunset grazed his wrist like a warning brand. Decisions, he realized, don't shout. They ripen in silence. And this one was almost ready. Behind the frosted glass of her office, Gina's voice was smooth-measured, transactional. "We can't let this affect the brand," she said, her tone threaded with habit rather than urgency. On her desk lay the complaint folder, now marked with corrections, dates shifted, phrases softened, cause blurred. She adjusted a line, erased another, then called the receptionist with a simple verbal note, "Handle inquiries quietly." Each movement was rehearsed, refined by repetition. It wasn't panic, it was protocol. Harlan stood outside, unseen, listening not to her words but to their rhythm, the choreography of concealment. Everything had its order: report, revise, reframe. The system protected itself, and Gina knew the steps by heart. He watched her silhouette move through the glass, efficient, elegant, unbothered. What chilled him wasn't her deceit, it was the calmness with which she performed it. The machinery of denial didn't creak, it purred. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and fatigue. Under the dull hum of ceiling lights, Harlan turned a corner and nearly collided with Elena. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Her hands clutched the strap of her worn bag, his lingered at the brim of his cap. Their eyes met, steady, searching, unguarded. She gave a small nod, not of gratitude but of recognition. You saw it too. He tilted his cap in return, a silent acknowledgement between two people bound by something they couldn't name. As they passed, the air seemed to tighten, carrying the sterile scent of bleach and something human beneath it, a promise unsaid. It wasn't alliance yet, only awareness, quiet and mutual. But in that instant, the walls of hierarchy softened. Between the one who had been stripped of power and the one who had hidden his understanding flickered a fragile thread, invisible yet real. In the back office, the ledger lay open on a steel counter, pages lined with small arithmetic betrayals. The entry for meal subsidy had been crossed out with a sharp pen stroke, replaced by VIP amenities. The ink was fresh, the handwriting unmistakable, Gina's looping script, confident, feminine, cruelly tidy. A carbon sheet beneath bore faint mirror marks of the same numbers. The paper still smelled of ink and correction fluid. Harlan ran his fingers along the margin, feeling the indentation where the pen had pressed too hard, as if to assert ownership over dishonesty. It wasn't the loss of a meal that struck him, it was the precision of theft, executed in the language of order. Each figure aligned neatly as though morality itself had been balanced out. He closed the ledger softly. In a place that worshipped numbers, this was scripture, and he had just read its heresy. The lobby at night felt cavernous, stripped of its daytime gloss. The marble floor reflected dim light, and somewhere near the bar, Travis laughed too loudly, phone raised, showing photos from the tour. Street food, he joked, the words bitten off with privilege. The younger staff laughed with him, nervous, eager, desperate to belong. The sound rolled across the empty space, echoing against glass and pride. Elena passed behind them, head lowered, her steps soft, precise, as though hoping invisibility could shield her. None of them looked her way. Harlan stood near a column, half in shadow, watching. The scene was almost ritualistic, humiliation performed without malice, cruelty sustained by habit. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The laughter told him everything. Disrespect wasn't an act here, it was culture. And every echo that reached him confirmed how far the company had drifted from the humanity it once sold. In the dim staff lounge, Elena sat beneath a weak yellow bulb, the kind that made everything look tired. Her backpack strap had torn again. She pulled out a spool of white thread from her pocket, threading the needle with slow precision. Each stitch landed evenly careful and small, the rhythm of someone used to mending what others broke. The light fell across her shoulders, outlining the narrow slope of fatigue. Across the hall, unseen, Harlan watched the rise and fall of her hand, the calm persistence in it. The thread gleamed faintly against the frayed fabric, fragile yet firm. He reached into his pocket, feeling the folded note press against his palm. For a moment, the paper and the thread felt the same, thin, unimportant, but holding something larger together. His jaw tightened, then eased. The decision forming in him was no longer emotional, it was structural. The repair she made was small. The one he would make would not be. Morning had not yet broken when Harlan stepped into the courtyard, the air sharp and colorless. His gray shirt was crisp, his cap pulled low, though soon it wouldn't be needed. Each step carried intent, quiet and direct. He pulled out his phone, dialed a short internal number, and spoke only a few words. Gather everyone at 9. No explanation, no tone, just instruction. As he ended the call, his reflection caught in the glass door, dim and double. For weeks he had watched, recorded, endured. Now the waiting had shape. He inhaled once deeply, as though steadying himself before stepping into cold water. The pocket on his chest still carried the folded note, pressing lightly against him with every breath. When he finally exhaled, his hands dropped to his sides. Something inside had locked into place. The man pretending was gone. What remained was the one ready to reveal. The conference room doors swung open, releasing a slice of white light that cut across the hallway. Inside, staff had begun to gather, some whispering, others scrolling their phones. Travis lounged in a chair, legs crossed, grin half-formed, confidence radiating from habit. Gina stood by the screen, checking her watch, posture sharp as ever. The atmosphere hummed with shallow unease, the kind that precedes performance. Then, from the corridor, footsteps. Harlan appeared in the doorway, the brim of his cap still shadowing his face. For a breath, no one recognized him. The room's low chatter thinned. He paused just long enough for silence to fall, then stepped forward, crossing the line between observer and actor. The light hit him full, catching the gray of his shirt, the steadiness of his gaze. Behind him, the door stayed open as if the air itself demanded witness. Something irreversible had begun. The room fell into an unnatural stillness. The air conditioning hummed faintly, yet even that sound seemed to retreat when Harlan stepped forward. He reached up, removed his cap, and set it on the table. The gesture was unhurried, almost delicate, yet it severed two worlds at once. For weeks he had been a shadow, a nameless traveler blending into the noise. Now the posture changed, quiet authority unfurling like a withheld breath. His gaze swept the room, methodical, deliberate, meeting each face as if counting truths owed. "My name is Harlan Voss," he said simply. "CEO. No preamble, no explanation. Just that." The silence that followed wasn't disbelief, it was recognition dressed as paralysis. Gina's polished poise cracked a fraction. Travis's smirk faltered. Every surface, the glass, the marble, the people reflected him differently now. In that absence of noise, power didn't announce itself. It revealed itself, calm, undeniable, and cold. He began without notes. The words came precise, each detail placed with surgical steadiness. On Monday at 12:45, a guest took a staff member's lunch, he said, listing the event as one would list weather data. At 1:20, no one intervened. At 2:10, management ignored it. He continued policy memos, altered ledgers, the red ink that turned meals into profits. Every timeline intersected with a choice, and every choice had a witness. He laid them out like coordinates, his voice flattening excuses into evidence. Then, from his pocket, he withdrew the folded note. Its edges were soft, now worn from his handling. He placed it on the table beside the ledger. "This," he said, "is the most honest document this company owns." Faces shifted. no one moved. In that moment, the story stopped belonging to rumor or defense. It belonged to record, and records, unlike people, do not forget. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The cadence of his words carried weight sharper than volume could manage. Each sentence landed evenly, cutting through the sterile air of the room. His gaze lingered one by one on Travis, who looked away first, on Gina, whose eyes dropped to her manicured hands, on the staff who met each other's eyes with guilt and relief entwined. No accusation, only clarity. Elena stood just beyond the doorway, unseen by most, her breath shallow as she listened. The tension was clinical, not theatrical. It was the kind of silence born when truth becomes undeniable. Harlan's composure was almost unnatural, every gesture measured, every pause deliberate. The moral weight in the room shifted toward him, drawn not by anger but by precision. And when he finally stopped speaking, the absence of his voice carried louder than any outrage could. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a reckoning delivered in perfect stillness. Harlan's words landed with surgical precision, not vengeance. He began with structure names, actions, outcomes. "Mr. Travis Henderson," he said evenly, "your service contract is terminated effective immediately. You will issue a written apology and cover the cost of damages." The silence thickened as security quietly stepped forward. Then, turning toward the table where Gina stood, Harlan continued. "Ms. Rourke, you are placed under suspension, pending internal review." No one gasped. The authority in his tone left no space for disbelief. He outlined new orders, a full audit of employee welfare, immediate reinstatement of the lunch program, and a company-wide initiative, Empathy First Training. Lastly, he announced a fund for any staff member who ever has to choose between hunger and duty again. Each declaration landed like the clicking of gears realigning. Justice here wasn't chaos, it was architecture being rebuilt, piece by deliberate piece. What began as humiliation had turned into reform, calm, structured, and absolute. By afternoon, the reversal was official. Elena Moore's employment was reinstated without condition. The HR document bore Harlan's signature, a single line that carried the weight of restitution. Alongside came the backdated compensation, unused leave restored, and a note handwritten this time, granting her authority to test a redesigned tour route. When the announcement reached the team, there was no applause, just the slow, visible lift of heads long bent under quiet compliance. Harlan addressed them briefly. "Kindness," he said, "is not a gesture here. It's policy." The words were simple, but something in the air shifted like color returning to a washed-out frame. Elena stood at the center, not as the victim the system had made her, but as the example it now chose to follow. Her name was spoken again in the open. That was the restoration, not just of work, but of worth. At the closing meeting, Harlan reached into his folder and unfolded a familiar piece of paper, the old creased tour map Elena had used every day. The edges were soft, the ink faded the fold lines permanent. He handed it back to her. "You know this route better than anyone," he said. "Show us where it needs to change." Elena studied it for a moment, then drew a small circle near a resting spot. "Add a bench here," she murmured, "and time for water." Her voice no longer tentative. It carried authority, earned, not given. Harlan nodded and signed the amendment into policy on the spot. Around them, staff watched, some smiling, others simply breathing easier. For the first time, Elena's smile was unguarded, untouched by fatigue. The map, once a symbol of endurance, had become one of redesign. It wasn't just returned to her, it was entrusted. The company, for once, was learning to follow. When the meeting ended, no one clapped. The air carried a kind of reverence that didn't need sound. People stood in quiet acknowledgement, small nods, brief eye contact, and unspoken agreement that something larger had shifted. Elena gathered her new badge from the table. The plastic gleamed faintly under the recessed lights. Harlan placed his cap back on, smoothing the brim as though sealing the moment, and walked toward the exit. Behind him, the HR team pinned a new notice to the board policy update employee welfare and meal program restored. The paper fluttered once, then stilled. The last door closed with a soft click, leaving only the hum of ventilation and the faint echo of shoes against marble. Justice, he thought, didn't need applause to be real. It only needed witnesses who finally looked up. Morning light spread evenly across the courtyard, brushing the new logo printed on the tour bus Empathy Tours. Elena stood at the front, a clipboard in one hand, her new name tag catching the sun. The group behind her waited, diverse, curious, quieter than the last. The schedule pinned near the door showed clearly marked rest breaks, hydration stops, and meal intervals. Nearby, an assistant loaded standard lunchboxes into a cooler, each labeled by name. The rhythm of the place had changed, measured humane. Harlan watched from a distance, leaning casually by the gate. It wasn't pride he felt, but assurance, the slow satisfaction of watching a system relearn decency through procedure. The difference was in the details. No one rushed, no one begged for pause. Kindness was no longer improvised, it was operational. Inside the bus, a soft banner read, "Every act of kindness counts." Elena opened her small notebook, recording gestures in tidy handwriting, staff, sharing umbrellas, guests offering seats, a driver pausing for an elderly couple. On one line, she wrote about a child who split her candy with a stranger and smiled as if it were the simplest thing in the world. The passengers were invited to note what kindness they witnessed. Soon, the pages began to fill. By the time the tour reached the final stop, the logbook was a quiet archive of decency. Harlan sat near the back, half hidden, reading the list over her shoulder. A faint smile crossed his face, not of triumph, but of relief. The culture had begun to rewrite itself. No speech, no ceremony, just the quiet proof that when kindness is seen, it multiplies. The office was still washed in the soft amber of late afternoon. On the glass desk, Harlan placed a small silver lunchbox, its surface polished, its purpose transformed. Etched across the lid were 5 words. It started with lunch. The phrase gleamed when the light caught it, bending into a quiet truth he no longer needed to explain. Beside it lay the new policy handbook, corners, sharp ink, fresh, a system rebuilt around what had once been overlooked. For a moment his hand rested on the lid. The metal was cool, unyielding, yet it carried warmth from his touch. He closed it gently, as if sealing not an object but a lesson. In that single motion, the relic of a failure became the mark of a legacy. Some stories, he thought, don't end with justice, they end with understanding. The floor-to-ceiling window mirrored Harlan back at himself, split down the center by a shaft of light. On one side stood the CEO, composed, polished. On the other, the man who had once chosen silence. He lifted a hand, fingers brushing the cold surface. The glass blurred the line between both versions, merging them briefly before the outside world came into focus. Beyond the window, the first Empathy Tour buses began to roll out their white frames, glinting under the sun. A dry leaf drifted past the roof, catching the air just long enough to fall softly out of sight. Harlan's gaze followed it until it disappeared. His reflection lingered a second longer, steady now, almost peaceful. Change, he realized, doesn't announce itself. It simply leaves behind a cleaner mirror. Harlan stepped away from the glass, his reflection shrinking into the afternoon light. Inside, the team moved in quiet rhythm, signing a simple welcome banner, their motions calm, certain. The Empathy Tour's plaque shimmered softly against the wall. Elena passed by, pausing just long enough to meet his eyes. No words, just understanding. He nodded once, pulling his gray cap low, the fabric of his shirt smooth and uncreased. As he walked out, the message settled clear as sunlight. Real change doesn't need applause or headlines. It needs people who choose decency when no one is watching. Kindness doesn't echo. It endures.